So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. And, I haven't actually met, but I've heard a lot about both Maurice and the Global Institute for Food Security. My good friend Ernie Barber took me out for coffee one day when it was first an idea before it was created, and Ernie was the provost at the time and former dean of agriculture and engineering. So he espoused the incredible vision behind this new organization, and I understand it's now a couple of years, 4 years actually, I think now behind it, and I've been able to through the industry hear all this incredible new things that are coming out of it. So I'm not going to review the entire bio because it's lengthy and highly accomplished, and it's all in front of you and you can read it yourselves. But I will invite Maurice to come up and provide his presentation. So join me in welcoming him. Thanks. Good to meet you.
Well, thanks for that kind invitation. And whatever's in the bio, it's probably all lies anyway. So forgive me. But it's a real pleasure to have this invitation to come and speak to you today. And I realize just from listening to some of the presentations, this is a very sophisticated audience, and obviously you have spent, all of you, a lot of time thinking about the carbon economy and how it impacts on agriculture, and equally how agriculture is going to impact on that economy. We've moved into a different world over the last 10 or 15 years, and as a result, carbon is a currency, just like dollars are. So because we're the Global Institute for Food Security, I'll take a bit of a big picture view initially. Some of the first few slides will be a bit facile to this audience, but it's really just to bring you into the overall story that I want to introduce a few global ideas here. First of all, we're in a situation where carbon more and more is getting a really bad rap. It's got a very bad reputation now, and we hear terms like carbon as a pollutant and so on. Well, it depends what you like about carbon. If you've been a bad individual at Christmas, you might get the thing on the right in your stocking, a piece of coal. But on the other hand, if you're looking forward to getting engaged, and the thing on the left, which is also just a bunch of carbon atoms in crystalline form, looks pretty good. So you can look at carbon a lot of different ways, and you can form a lot of different conclusions about it. I just want to take exception to the idea that now we are using this pejorative term. It's more politically used, but the pejorative term pollutant when we talk about carbon dioxide. Obviously, for the plant biologists amongst you, you know darn well that carbon dioxide is far from a pollutant. It's an absolutely necessary molecule for life on the planet. Carbon monoxide, one oxygen molecule, I could call that a pollutant because there's very few circumstances under which you could think of carbon monoxide as something beneficial. But of course, carbon dioxide is one of those things that is absolutely essential. And so it's odd that we've ended up allowing pejorative language like that, but this is when politics overlaps with quantitative science, we begin to use terms like that. In fact, if you think about it, that's what CO2 enables. It's this beautiful green pastoral landscape of trees and crops growing. That's really where our CO2 is destined. Now, we've seen a couple of diagrams about the carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle is obviously critical to life on the planet. We forget that an awful lot of it is actually controlled at the oceanic level, and there's a lot of that we can't do an awful lot about. There's exchange of CO2 from oceans due to respiration, but then there's a lot of photosynthesis going on in the oceans which fixes carbon, and It's not exactly in equilibrium, and it depends, of course, on a number of factors I'll talk about now, but that is probably accounting for half of the carbon exchange that's taking place on the planet, probably a bit more. But if you look at the offending carbon dioxide, which is often related to human activity using fossil fuels, it is actually a relatively small amount of the total carbon transactions that take place in atmospheric exchanges. Now, I don't want to belittle it in that sense. It's still very important, but it's not an intractable problem, and it is something that I would like to propose to this audience, that there are many things that we can do in order to intervene and improve the situation. Where I will get to towards the end of this talk is really that agriculture is not just in a situation where it needs to adapt to climate change, but in fact agriculture and forestry will play a big part in mitigating climate change as well. So if you actually look on the right and the left-hand side, you'll see the relative numbers. The carbon exchange associated with photosynthesis and plant life, terrestrial photosynthesis, much bigger numbers than actually on the right-hand side in terms of the carbon emissions that come from industrialization. So sequestering carbon through photosynthesis is actually the most important fixation process. It was great to hear Biological Carbon Canada earlier on, because that is the most important thing to emphasize. If we're talking about carbon transactions, I'm all in favor of green technology and so on and so forth, but green and clean technology. But if you're looking at the magnitude of the transactions of carbon dioxide, biological carbon fixation is by far and away the most important thing that happens on the planet. Now, why has it all gone wrong? Well, that certainly ends up in very long debates depending on the political spectrum of the audience. But I think, like I said, this is a sophisticated audience dealing with the fact that one way or another we are seeing the effects of climate change around the planet, and there's been evidence of it even in our own country. But around the world, it's not hard to pick up evidence of these creeping changes that are occurring. For about 10,000 years, up to the time of the Industrial Revolution, carbon levels in the atmosphere stayed pretty static. They were around about 280 parts per million. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, you can see from this graph the purple curve here, you can see the emissions due to the Industrial Revolution became significant. And as they became significant, you can see the uptick there in the lighter blue line, indicating that there is an influence of carbon release due to all the fossil fuels that we've been using, and basically human activity. Now, when you have any kind of perturbation like that, when you've had at least 10,000 years, that's only the part we could measure. We probably couldn't go back and accurately an awful lot more than that, because it's done with ice cores and isotope ratios. So, but when you change what was a homeostatic situation in a relatively short period of time, it's going to be cause for concern. And that's obviously why climate scientists around the world have focused in on this uptick that's occurred basically in a relatively short period of time. And I think you all know the mechanism by which this occurs. As CO2 builds up in the atmosphere, the CO2 is then trapping sunlight. There's a lot more vibrational energy trapped from sunlight, and as a result, little by little, we can get these increases in global temperatures. Not necessarily uniformly. I think everybody here knows that it's a bit skewed to the poles as well. You get much larger fluctuations at either pole than we do around the equator. But on average, we have been seeing increases in global temperatures. The worry about that is that these things can get out of control. So let's just say you could turn the switch on and turn the switch off for CO2 in the atmosphere, then obviously we'd be in fine shape. But supposing there are tipping points at which increases in temperature begin to affect other processes over which we have very little control. Increased temperature in the oceans could increase respiration in the oceans, and now we get a lot more CO2 generated simply because of the temperature. In other words, that's a positive feedback mechanism. It's hard to get out of that without some sort of radical intervention. That's the kind of worry that climate scientists are referring to. The melting of certain ice packs in Greenland and so on. If you did end up with land, say, let's just say brown earth rather than snow, there's less reflection of the incident light, and consequently you will get more warming up. So you get warming because of warming. So these are the ancillary consequences that climate scientists are clearly worried about. And that's why we do have to make sure that we understand, are there any tipping points beyond which we will not be able to control this? Now, if you look at the curve since the Industrial Revolution and these emissions, you could also scratch your head and say, well, it's interesting, it only actually got up to about 400 parts per million. There's a lot of reasons why it could have actually increased an awful lot more, and it hasn't. And why is that? Why is it we're not at 600 parts per million right now, which probably would be beyond a tipping point? Well, there's great evidence from eminent scientists around the world who've monitored some of these things, that actually the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution has actually benefited us greatly. Scientists who work on photosynthesis know that the carbon dioxide concentration that is available to the photosynthetic apparatus in the chloroplasts, the actual concentration will drive the forward reaction, and therefore more carbon will get fixed. And what's been found is, there's two studies I'm mentioning here. One was from Graham Farquhar down in Australian National University and CSIRO, in which they looked at, first of all, just by a mathematical model, increases in overall carbon dioxide. It wasn't since the Industrial Revolution. They did it, I think, from, the mid-80s. So that was a nice period where we had good measurements. And then there was about 14% increase there in CO2 during that period. And they predicted, therefore, that you could get up to a 10% increase in biomass that's essentially fixed from the atmosphere because of that increased concentration available to green plants. So then looking at the satellite measurements of the same thing, basically looking at green leaf area, and they did this initially with trees. Sure enough, they found that their model was not at all inaccurate. In fact, there was an 11% increase in biomass during that period. So actually, the increased CO2 in that case was favoring increasing yields. And I think the logic of it is not lost on you. Also, what that suggests is there is a thermostatic mechanism in place up to a certain point. As CO2 increases, photosynthetic rates will increase and they will sequester the carbon, so it'll then reduce the rate at which CO2 increases. A more recent study that's also being reported here from an international group involving China, North America, several labs in Asia. And what they've demonstrated here that over a very similar period, 1982 to 2009, that you could account for over 50% of the total increases in greening, the total increases in leaf area index that occurred due to this, what we now call CO2 fertilization effect. So it's pretty clear that as CO2 has gone up, it's not all been bad news, because we have all benefited from that. Crop yields have gone up, in part because of the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, that doesn't mean that because it's a good thing, you can't have too much of a good thing, and of course you can. So I think, you know, the outcome of this balance idea is that we do need to advocate for carbon balancing, rather than either demonizing one thing over another, or forgetting that agriculture and forestry is actually a major force for mitigation. It's not just a question of we have to adapt to our agriculture and forestry, but it is actually a force for mitigation. Now, obviously the big question would be, do the numbers stack up? Can the things that we can do by intervening either in forestry and agriculture even come close to the numbers that require mitigation? And I want to show you that that is in fact the case, and there is good reason to incentivize farmers and foresters to increase their carbon fixation, because it does move the needle, and it will move the needle substantially. So what are the factors that we could consider that will affect this carbon balancing? And it's been great just to hear some of these talks, because I think none of the things on the list are without controversy, but nevertheless they're all things that we can measure. I think reforestation, and particularly taking care of the boreal forest, is a critical element. We'll look at some numbers on that in a moment. The shift to no-till agriculture, which I think Canada has been a leader in, and the States, North America, basically because of the use of biotechnology crops, has made a very interesting dent in carbon sequestration in the soil. That one has been a bit controversial in the literature, even one of my alma maters, Rothamsted Research, published a paper a couple of years ago, David Paulson, in which the value of no-till was actually questioned in a very good paper in Nature Climate Change. But I have to say, the nub of the argument there was, if you take total bulk soil across a continent, and not just the topsoil that we generally farm, if you take the total bulk soil, the lower layers of the soil are pretty much static. Whatever carbon is sequestered, if you do not intervene in any way, most of that will remain static, and there's not an awful lot of oxygen down there to enhance respiration. But in the first 30 centimeters, which is the critical part of what we farm with, no-till agriculture has made a massive improvement in total soil organic matter. And I think, quite apart from carbon sequestration, those of you who've lived through that period of going from summer fallow into no-till agriculture will report back that soils in this province and across Western Canada have improved enormously as a result of that practice. Ratan Lal, who's one of the premier soil scientists in the world at Ohio State University, has also pointed out that without something like no-till, a lot of that topsoil would have disappeared anyway, and so it wouldn't be there to actually enhance carbon sequestration, and you've really got to take that into account as well. So I think that from what I've heard in the discussions here, people are clearly going to continue with no-till, there's no question about that, but I think the numbers are there to support the idea that that practice is helping to move the needle in the direction of sequestration. Nutrient and water efficient crops. Now we were just talking a little bit about nitrogen fertilizers, for example. Depending on the nitrogen fertilizer, of course, we can get a burst of nitrous oxide soon after the application on the soil. when that happens, nitrous oxide is roughly 300 times more pernicious a greenhouse gas than is CO2. And so that is a worry. So nutrient efficient crops where we could actually modulate very carefully our use of particularly nitrogen fertilizers, but then absorb the maximum quantity of what is used into the plant for use to make proteins in the plant, is probably going to significantly reduce the overall carbon footprint of agriculture and allow more carbon sequestration per unit of energy expended. And then some of the more technological things that are on the horizon, increasing photosynthetic rates, we'll talk a little bit about that, and also our ability to use novel methods of sequestering more biomass in the soil. And my colleague Leon Kotchin is here. He'll probably elaborate a little bit on this, because I'm going to just start the discussion going on the idea that roots, which are the unseen part of the plant for most of us, are a major force in helping us to sequester useful long-term carbon into the soil. So first of all, Canada's boreal forests, they are already a massive sink. There's been some numbers generated by recent reports that remind us that we forget how much carbon is actually being absorbed by our boreal forests. 208 billion tons of carbon estimated to be stored. Well, that kind of number does move the needle. That's well within the range. When we're talking about single-digit gigatons is the total estimated fossil fuel emissions, and we're saying in Canada alone the boreal forests are sequestering this amount of carbon, then clearly it's not towards the magnitude out, it's well within the range of affecting the overall atmospheric balance. Now clearly that's not something that we can neglect, but I think what is interesting as well to think about this, the total landmass of Canada and the population of Canada, 35 million right now, on a per capita basis, we are storing an awful lot more carbon than most countries. We're doing a lot of other people a favor apart from Canada. So Canada is in a special situation here. Probably Russia is as well, because of its massive landmass as well. But we need to take into account the overall ability of forests to absorb the kind of carbon that will make a difference. Now, we talked about no-till agriculture, and it's been amazing just to watch the change in agricultural practice over the years. I was a professor at the University of Calgary in the 80s and 90s, and used to collaborate with colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan National Research Council, and I remembered driving over from Calgary to Saskatchewan in just about time for seed drilling, and you'd see tractors out there with a big dust cloud behind the tractor, because the soil particle size and the soil quality and the organic matter in the soil had been so degraded at that point that we were this would be early 90s, we were late 80s, early 90s, we were at risk of having another dust bowl. People started to shift over to no-till agriculture, and it was remarkable to see over about a 5-year period, completely different farming practice. The fields looked totally different when they were seeded, but the most important thing was the soil moisture, the organic matter that ended up being sequestered in the soil. And I think very few farmers have ever been compensated for their contribution to carbon sequestration by this particular practice, but it's really moved the needle significantly. And of course, our colleagues in the United States basically following the same procedures with Roundup Ready soybeans as well. Now, I think the other things that we got to look at are just some of the numbers. How well can we measure these things? And I think What we've been able to show through studies that have been done right across Canada, involving reputable bodies like Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Soil Conservation Council of Canada, are the numbers of millions of tons of atmospheric carbon that have actually been sequestered by good management practices. And again, I don't know if many of our producers have really benefited in any financial way for what they have contributed to the overall global carbon fixation. But as you can see, the numbers are very significant. 22 million tons of atmospheric carbon dioxide each year by good management practices. But let's just talk a little bit then about other interventions which do depend on one or other form of technology, but which are well within our grasp. And the first one is what my colleague Leon Cochrane refers to as the hidden half. We can walk through a field of any crop and see that it's doing fine, but we have very little idea as to what the biomass is below ground. But of course, the biomass below ground can make a massive difference to the performance of the crop, absolutely, to its resilience, for sure, because things like drought tolerance and, in fact, nutrient efficiency will be controlled to a large extent by the root system and the efficiency of the root system. But a very interesting paper published by Doug Kell in the UK a few years ago modeled the idea of, he looked at deep-rooting grasses because there were a few genotypes that were coming out of some of the grassland research institutes in the UK. What about these deep-rooting grasses? How much carbon could they actually sequester? And all of this discussion was going on while people were, like in Australia, Michelle Watt was isolating drought-resistant wheats or drought-tolerant wheats that turned out to be tolerant because they had a much larger root mass than we were normally used to in a typical Australian cultivar. So when you think about deep-rooting grasses or deep-rooting crops with a large root biomass, that root biomass has sequestered a lot of carbon. And if it's not turning over at a very rapid rate through bacterial and fungal degradation into CO2, then it's also fixing carbon in a sustainable manner. So the calculation in this paper from Doug Kell was, first of all, fossil fuel burning generates right now about 8.4 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. Roots, if they were deep-rooting grasses or let's just say cereal crops, could absorb roughly 50 tons per hectare of carbon in this way. And if they could do, it would actually only take about 160 million hectares in order to completely offset the carbon that is generated by burning of fossil fuels, basically industrial carbon. Now those numbers I think are really interesting because that does tell you it's worthy of attempting this kind of intervention, that if we can actually use genetics to get productive crops and grasslands that have got much deeper rooting systems, this would also apply to reforesting with trees as well, then we've got an opportunity to sequester very meaningful amounts of carbon. And then finally, on the sort of technological intervention side, we know that photosynthesis in one form or another, at least in single cells, unicells, has been around for 2 to 3 billion years. So you would think this is a process that through evolution would have honed its skills and it would be the most efficient process on the planet. Turns out it isn't. And in fact, there are many types of photosynthesis going on. So we just take simply crop plants. We'll not even get into algae in the ocean and all that kind of stuff. Just taking crop plants. We have what we call C3 plants and C4 plants. C3 plants are actually about optimally about 4% efficient in turning incident radiation and converting that energy into carbon skeletons. Doesn't sound like, if you're an engineer, you'd say, I could probably work on that and improve the efficiency a bit. But we know from just from evolution that different forms of photosynthesis exist. Corn and sugarcane, which are very productive plants, are about 50% more efficient because they're about 6% efficient in their photosynthesis. How does it work? It really works by the same thing as I was talking about earlier on, which is carbon concentration mechanisms. So I mentioned the idea that productivity, photosynthetic productivity around the world has gone up just because carbon dioxide has increased, and that would actually continue. It'll get saturated at about 600 parts per million, and we hope we don't get to that point. But plants have already evolved to do this kind of thing. They've found ways of concentrating CO2 near the active site of photosynthesis, and as a result, it is just using observations from naturally occurring plants possible to provoke this shift. There is a large program around the world funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to see if it's possible to turn rice into a C4 plant, to make it as efficient as maize. That would make a massive difference to global food security, and that's something that's of great interest to us at the Global Institute for Food Security. But also, if you think about it in terms of carbon sequestration, it is also that kind of technology, a massive contribution. A simpler example, and this is one that could have easily been missed. This is from Steve Long's lab in University of Illinois, and he published it last year in Science. When our plants, crop plants, are out there in the field in full sunlight, think, well, full sunlight is a good thing for photosynthesis, and it generally is. But there is a point in full sun when the photosynthetic apparatus actually becomes overwhelmed. The technical term is it gets quenched, but it essentially means that it cannot adapt any better to the amount of photosynthetic radiation it's getting, and it kind of stalls. But in the real world, what happens is we go from bright sunlight to clouds that pass overhead and therefore knock out the direct sunlight, reduce the overall intensity. And when that happens, photosynthetic rates normally can continue and can continue in a way that they are not quenched, they're not inhibited by this overwhelming level of photosynthetic radiation. Now, what this group realized was plants do not adapt as rapidly to that switch between full bright sunlight and shade conditions. And they go into this kind of stasis where they have to metabolically account for this difference, this quenching, which is all to do with photosynthetic pigments and ancillary pigments that help in photosynthesis. And they thought, well, if we could intervene and just make that adaptation process between this stalled situation of quenching and taking full advantage of the shade situation to get maximum photosynthesis, there should be a gap that could be exploited. And sure enough, they found they could do that. They had to put 3 essentially new genes, not really new genes, but genes with different regulatory sequences into the plant. But they, as a result, in the field, I think I've got it there. Hang on. Yeah, there it is. In the field, they got a 20% increase. This is not in a greenhouse. This is actually field-grown plants. So it's a very interesting indication that although photosynthesis has been around for an awful long time, it is possible to fool a plant to do at least 20% better than it's done. Even with all the evolution that's gone on in photosynthesis. So these interventions, which are actually things that are in the field, they're being tested by labs around the world right now, these aren't science fiction. These are things that we can actually conceive of intervening with. A 20% increase in carbon sequestration due to agriculture and forestry, for that matter, would way overcompensate for the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere using fossil fuels, which obviously we're trying to reduce in any case. So if I can conclude, my first point right at the beginning was I really don't like the idea of carbon dioxide being called a pollutant. It most certainly isn't, but just like anything in life, you can have too much of a good thing. And too much of this good thing can cause significant problems, because there will be tipping points at which any intervention would have to be so extreme that we might not be able to catch up with it. Hence the worry about climate change. But photosynthesis is still the major transactor of carbon. And although we have engineering solutions and carbon sequestration at power stations and so on and so forth, the numbers involved in that are trivial compared to the numbers of carbon transaction that takes place because of biological factors. And we've already seen increased CO2 has resulted in substantial yield increases. To go back to a situation where we had 280 parts per million might not be a good thing. It might actually significantly reduce our overall crop yields. But at this point, we don't have enough control to even determine what point we might end up with. I think it's fair to say that we don't want to see levels go much beyond where we are right now, 400 parts per million. And we're, at the moment, going up maybe 2 ppm a year. So it's edging up, and any interventions are going to be critical. But I think I've shown with some simple examples and where the numbers are well reported in the literature, agriculture and forestry sequesters a massive amount of carbon, and the opportunities to do better on that are all there. Are we going to provide the incentives to our farmers and foresters to do even better on this? This is a question that has to be interwoven into this whole question of a carbon economy. And then finally, I would say that, and this may be self-interest for the country of Canada, but actually Canada is a special case. It's a low population, it's a high CO2 fixing entity as a political entity, and we are probably, if you take all into account, already net positive, and therefore sequestering carbon for colleague countries around the world. We can do better. But the fact of the matter is we should not underestimate the contribution that Canada uniquely makes to the carbon economy. Thank you.